Hello fellow glue sniffers and sprue snippers, welcome back to Blitzkrieg Model Works. In this video I'm going to be moving on to the photo etch with Voyager set PE 35869. I'm going to start with the rear hull. This is a brace for the starter crank. Now Voyager give you some photo etch to replace this part, but it's really fiddly and you have to round one into a circle. It's going to be really hard for me to try and do this, but the kit part looks alright. I'll just have to thin it out a little bit. And on the other armored exhaust cover is a convoy light. Now this is the earlier version. The Voyager set give you the later version, so that's the one that we're going to go with. This is the original plastic foot for the jack along with the Voyager photo etch replacement. I soldered it after folding it and then I superglued it in place on the plastic part. I finished assembling the rear hull by putting the access panels on before I start assembling the photo etch. You can leave several access panels open if you want to pose it open for maintenance or if you want to have the vehicle in a hand crank starting position. But check your references because these can vary by vehicle type. I cleaned up the right side exhaust cover and installed it. I did drill out the hole for the starter brace and cleaned up around it a bit to thin it out. After cleaning up the left side cover and removing the molded on convoy light, I built the replacement Voyager one right on top of the original location. This later style round convoy light used a round housing rather than the rectangular box. Voyager include some styrene rod in with their kit for you to use as a replacement part. Now the PE exhaust frames need to be bent around the exhaust pipes before we install them. I'll start to do the bend gently by pressing a small metal tube the same size as the kit exhaust part onto the PE part while using an eraser as a cushion. You can get a package of metal tubing of random sizes and lengths from your local hobby shop. You have to keep the tube at a 90-degree angle to the part to make sure it stays straight and square so it doesn't look crooked when you mount it on the rear hull, because a crooked frame or exhaust tube will look really obvious. I know there's benders out there just for this application, but I don't have one, and I've used this technique for years and it's worked just fine for me. Once I'm satisfied I've got the initial bend nice and square, I'll finish it up by hand just using my fingers and fingernails. There, nice and round, fits nice around the exhaust pipe. Now ready for the rest of the bends. And after more than a few minutes and a few creative swear words, I'm done. And I only use tweezers, pliers, and metal shapes along with my fingers. I superglued the frames onto the hull and then glued the exhausts on top using the original locating holes as a guide. The strip of styrene under the exhaust has stopped me from crushing the PE to the rear hull while I'm trying to glue everything together. Instead of using Voyager's PE bolt detail on the frames, which I find a little light, I use some Grantline bolts, number 62. Grantline are still around. They're now known as San Juan details. They cater primarily to the model railroad community but have several items for armor builds that we may find useful. I've been using them for years. The parts are tiny and some have some flash, but it's usually pretty minimal and you can work around it. You glue them into place by placing some super glue on the part, and then you just place it on the glue. I use the tip of a sharp blade, but you could use a wax pencil or a jewelry pencil. If you try to use tweezers, you'll just glue everything together. And there, we're all done. And I'll fill all the locating holes before painting. I used the original jack bracket frame of locating holes to fit the PE replacement parts. I also bought one of those head magnifiers with the LED lights in it. It's okay, but it's a tad bit heavy for my nose, but it works well otherwise. And I just make sure the jack fits before attaching the rest of the PE bracket parts. And here's the completed assembly. It all looks nice and overall looks pretty good to scale. When I assembled the travel lock, I used a small wire I ran through a hole on either end of the assembly to keep the entire piece together and aligned while I stacked and glued everything into position. The replacement part doesn't function, and it's really fiddly to assemble, but oh my, does it look so much better than the original plastic part. And here's the completed travel lock. I used more of the same Grantline nuts to dress up the chain more. It's so much better than the kit part in spite of how fiddly it is to make. And moving on to the engine deck, I've got most of the plastic parts installed, including the handholds for the engine access cover. I'll use the Voyager PE screens provided in their set for the engine deck screens and radiator screens. These are incredibly fine and 3D in appearance. And I even get to make the heater tower detail from parts. Fun! Now when I work on PE or take parts off a fret, I use this stand I made for my pan of ice, although any vise would work. I used a piece of a dollar store work mat and put some double-sided sticky tape on one end. I stick the PE fret onto the tape and cut the parts off I need. The tape prevents the parts from flying off into infinity and starves the carpet monster. But you still have to be careful removing the part from the tape. It works with even the smallest of PE parts. Now you don't need to use tape for every single part, usually just the smaller and more delicate ones. Using the vise helps elevate the work and gives me some place to brace my wrists so I'm not shaking so bad when I'm doing all of my folding. A quick gentle sanding. Even with PE, I like to dry fit everything I can before I glue it. It's a lot easier to fix it now than after you glue it down and found out you screwed up. I'm going to glue the screens down using medium thickness super glue and my candle applicator. Super glue doesn't seem to stick to my tweezers nearly as bad as it does to my fingers. And yes, I got stuck. The rest went in the same way. Just use small amounts of glue or it'll show through the screens and make a really big mess that's almost impossible to clean up. You know, I think using engine deck PE screens is a great way to start out using PE. They're flat and very simple to install. The round screens are a little bit trickier to get centered. Just take your time and line it up. Brace yourself if you have the shakes a bit. That's why I made this platform that fits my Panavise. I can brace my wrists on the sides most of the time, help eliminating any shakiness that I happen to have. And here's everything but the heater tower. I'll carefully remove all the parts for the heater tower. I'll use another piece of tubing to start the bend in the outer wrap. It's a lot easier to work with if it's tighter wound than looser. It'll hug the inner ring of the other round parts a lot better. Glue the piece in one spot and wrap it around, putting in a little bit of glue as you go wherever you can. And there's one step done. And there, the top ring is added and the screen tower is installed. And here's the finished result with the mounting bracket for the spare vent panels. And next I'm going to detail the insides of the driver and radio operator or bow gunner's hatches. Now I know it's hard to see, but there is detail on both the inside of the hatch and the inside of the hull opening with the spring assist device being seen inside the opening. Now Voyager include almost all the parts for these, but not the sanity you'll need to be able to put them together. As usual, I'll take all the parts off and prep them first. Okay, here's a completed spring assist device installed in the driver's position. For the tiny wire I used on the spring assist devices, I used wire I got out of a charge cable from a defunct charging cable. Use 9 wraps to replicate the spring. You can see this in reference photos. And the finished inside hatch. This replaces the kit parts and it's all provided except for yet some more Grant line nuts. So I've got everything here laid out for the next set for the bow gunner's side. First, the hatch handle. I glue the piece of provided styrene cut to length to the washer part E50. Using the double-sided sticky tape makes this a lot easier. Then I feed the handle, part D18, down on top, and so on, stacking the parts to make an assembly. And I'm so sorry, I honestly thought I'd recorded me building the whole thing, but I guess not. Next I started on the rear tool bins. These include mounting frames to the hull so you could pose the tank with one or both of these gone and have the mounting frame remaining on the vehicle. The toolboxes even offer workable hinges if you're up for the challenge. These are some of the largest photo etch parts in the set and they do need a fair bit of folding. For the press strengthening ribs on the boxes, I used the end of my spatula on my work mat to impress them in. I had to press really hard to make the ribs. Usually I use a used up ballpoint pen, but I couldn't press hard enough with it to make it work. It's important to make sure the work surface is smooth and doesn't have a texture. That texture will get imparted into the part and it'll show up in your finished paint job. Now that looks much better. I use either tweezers or these pliers usually to bend PE. The lid comes next. And here's the fitted parts. Everything I can is soldered here for strength. I fit the hinge pins. The real job here was trying to keep it straight. Very gently bend the hinge over and tuck it in, and then do the same thing on the other side. And finished. Now for the latches. I cut off and prepped the 2 latches for each side. These are all one piece, although they are very tiny and fragile. And just as bad as the corresponding cleat. So I glued the cleats to the lid. And once they've set, I'll slide the latches over the cleat and glue those in place. Then fold the cleats once everything there is dry. They are supposed to wrap back on themselves a little bit, so you can trim off the excess if there is any. And this is one of the completed rear tool bins. There, and there's the 2 completed tool bins. You can damage these a lot more realistically than the plastic kit ones as well.
Okay, I've done these off camera because it's really fiddly for me to deal with. I went and I soldered all of the joints together. If you followed along on the Facebook page, you can see, I'm going to try not to drop this. You can see this is all soldered. I actually lost a part for the top. I'm going to have to scratch build it. This is part of the rack that holds these tools, which you have to use. They kind of screw you up on the tools. This is not A18, it's P18. Part A18 is the bow machine gun. This is not F, these are I. And this is actually a J, not an F. I still have a few other pieces to do. I've got the cable winder to do, and I've got the gun rod cleaning tube. Now I'm going to take all the detail off except the very end cap detail. I'm going to be taking the clasps off and replacing all of this stuff with PE, but using this tube, solid molded. And here's the original frames. A little bit of an improvement. And the one for the jack block. That's the kit one, complete with punch-out marks.
And finally, the turret. It comes 3D printed in one piece. Neither the mantlet nor the rear hatch work, and the rangefinders appear to be solid. There's options for one of 3 different types of plastics. I picked the cheapest one of the 3 as the pictures on Shapeways didn't show any texture, and I wanted to add my own cast texture to the turret anyway. The white natural versatile plastic option has quite the pronounced print texture. This actually works to my advantage. It'll give the putty a really good tooth to grab onto while I do the cast texture. I'm going to try and make all of these layers of plastic disappear under this cast texture. I started with my usual diluted coat of Tamiya putty and liquid cement. This will flow into the raw plastic and provide a really good key for the texture coat later on. I'm not really interested in anything other than getting as much putty into the pores of this plastic as I could right now. As you can see, this coat won't fill in all of the 3D printed lines on its own. And here's the finished cast texture, more or less. Once the first layer set, I used Tamiya putty right out of the tube and scraped it across the turret surface in straight horizontal lines. I'd seen this type of a texture on real tank turrets, although it's not this rough. I'm going to knock the texture down a bit with some sandpaper and steel wool when it's done. And here both the turret and mantlet have been done, slightly different, but they're not smoothed out yet. And the rear hatch will get a much smoother finish than the rest of the turret. I painted the turret with a quick coat of Tamiya XF89 dark green 2. I wanted to see what the texture looked like under the finished coat of paint, which is going to be this color. Yeah, the lift ring broke off. I'll replace it later on with some wire. So I started the mantlet cover by outlining the gun mantlet with some evergreen styrene strip. I just tack it down with some super glue, gently bending and trimming it as I need and as I go. Once the mantlet was finished, I made the corresponding frame on the turret. Well, I looked at some real-world examples to see how these are actually done and how everything's bolted in. I didn't base this on any specific design. Next, I started sculpting the Mantlet cover in place. I used Milliput white putty, as you can use paintbrush and water to smooth out and blend the putty to make it look like real waterproof fabric. Once the base layer was in place, I rolled some very small rolls of epoxy putty to replicate folds in the fabric, and then I dent the putty in place with a spatula to make even deeper folds. I haven't done any sculpting like this for over 20 years, and I didn't do it very much back then. I think this turned out pretty well. I wrapped it around the sides and tucked it just underneath the bottom. Being able to smooth everything down with water and a wet paintbrush really made a big difference in smoothing this out nicely. Once I was satisfied with the look, I set the turret aside for the putty to harden. Next, I started marking and drilling out all the holes for the handholds, foliage loops, and I'll install those. Again, my own idea, not based on anything specific. The foliage loops are installed by threading metal wire through the holes I drilled. Once I pull the wire through the back enough, I use a piece of 1mm styrene rod to keep the loops the same size. Don't pull the wire too tight or the rod won't come out. There, all straight, even, and level.
And here it is, all done. Just a couple of parts left to put on. That'll go on after painting. Just the retaining chains, and I gotta straighten some of the holding clips down, and still have to do the tow cables and the track cable. So the next time you see this, I'll be ripping all the parts off and painting it. So thanks a lot. If anybody has any comments or questions, please in the comment section below. And thanks again for watching. Enjoy the slideshow. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.